The phone in my shirt pocket buzzed against my chest right as my daughter-in-law was passing the gravy boat down the table. I almost didn't reach for it. You know how it is at Thanksgiving. You've got 8 people watching you, the turkey's been sitting there for 10 minutes already, and the last thing anyone wants is for Grandpa to start fiddling with his phone like some teenager. But it buzzed again, and then a third time. That's the thing that made me look. 3 calls back to back from a number I didn't recognize, an area code I'd never seen before. I excused myself, said I'd be right back, and stepped out to the porch where I could hear over the sound of my grandson banging his fork against his water glass. The voice on the other end didn't bother saying hello. It just said, "If you've got any sense left in your head, you'll get back to your house tonight. Don't wait. Don't tell anyone where you're going. Just drive." Then the line went dead before I could ask who it was. Before I get into what happened next, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button down there, and tell me in the comments what time it is where you're watching from. I read every one of them, and it means more than you know. So there I was, on the back porch of my son's house in a town outside Wilmington, North Carolina, holding a dead phone in my hand, with the smell of sage stuffing drifting out through the screen door behind me, and I couldn't tell you which way was up. I'm 67 years old. My wife Rosalind passed 3 years ago this coming February, and since then, holidays have been a kind of careful project for me. I plan them. I prepare for them. I drive the 4 hours from my place near Asheville to my son Beckett's house, and I put on a face, and I try to be the kind of grandfather Rosalind would have wanted me to be for our 2 grandkids. I don't get a lot of these chances anymore, so when something tries to pull me away from the table on Thanksgiving night, my first instinct is to ignore it. But that voice, there was something about it. Not panicked exactly. More like a person who has already made up their mind and is just doing you the courtesy of telling you what's coming. I stood there for maybe a full minute, trying to decide if I'd really heard what I thought I heard. The phone showed the call had lasted 11 seconds. I walked back inside. My daughter-in-law, Marisol, looked up from cutting a piece of turkey for our granddaughter, and her face did something I didn't catch in the moment, but that I would think about later for weeks. A small flicker, a tiny tightening around the eyes. Then she smiled and asked if everything was all right. I said it was just one of those robocall things. You know, the ones that pretend to be from the IRS. Beckett laughed without looking up from his plate and said something about how somebody ought to put those people in jail. I sat back down. I tried to eat. The mashed potatoes tasted like glue in my mouth. Now, let me back up here, because some of this won't make sense unless I tell you about how the day even started. Beckett had called me 3 weeks earlier, out of the blue. We hadn't spoken since Father's Day, and even that conversation had been short. Him saying thanks for the card, me asking about the kids, him saying he had to run because Marisol needed help with something. That had been the pattern for about a year and a half. Short calls, long silences, texts that never quite got answered. I'd told myself it was just life. He had 2 kids under 10, a job that ate his weekends, a wife who came from a big family and pulled him in their direction. I told myself a lot of things to keep from feeling what I was feeling, but 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, the phone rang on a Wednesday afternoon, and there was Beckett, sounding warm in a way I hadn't heard since Rosalind's funeral. "Dad, we want you to come up for Thanksgiving, the whole thing. Stay a few nights. The kids have been asking about you." I was sitting on the back deck when he said it, and I'll tell you the truth. My eyes filled up so fast I couldn't see the bird feeder 10 feet away. I said yes before he could finish the sentence. He laughed and said something about how he'd missed me, and I believed him. I wanted to believe him so bad, it didn't even occur to me to ask, why now? Why this year? Why after all this quiet? I spent 2 weeks getting ready. I cleaned out my truck. I bought presents for the grandkids, a remote control fire engine for the boy, a set of watercolor paints for the girl, the kind with the little brushes in a wooden case. I dug out Rosalind's recipe for cranberry orange relish, the one she made every year, and I called the produce lady at the grocery store to make sure she'd have fresh cranberries the week up. I picked up a bottle of bourbon for Beckett because I remembered him liking it, and a candle that smelled like fig and cedar for Marisol because I'd seen her light something similar once and didn't know what else to bring a daughter-in-law I barely knew. I packed the truck on Tuesday night. I went to bed early. I lay there in the dark and thought about how Rosalind would have been so happy, How she'd been the one for years who'd kept the line open between me and Beckett, how she'd been the bridge, and how when she died, something on his side of the bridge had quietly been pulled up. The drive over was long but easy. I had the radio on a station that played old country, and I sang along to songs I hadn't heard in 20 years. I pulled into Beckett's driveway around 2 in the afternoon on Thanksgiving Day. The house was bigger than I remembered. They'd moved twice since I'd last visited. And this place sat back from the road behind a row of quaint myrtles, with a wraparound porch and a swing on it. My granddaughter Rin came running out before I could even get the door open, and she threw her arms around my legs. My grandson Theo hung back on the porch, suddenly shy in the way little boys get, and I knelt down and held out my hand to him like we were two grown men meeting for the first time, and he came over and shook it. I almost cried right there on the gravel. Inside, the house smelled like turkey and wood smoke. Marisol had set the table with a runner the color of dried leaves, and there were little pumpkins along it, and place cards she'd written by hand. Beckett came out of the kitchen with a dish towel over his shoulder and hugged me. A real hug, the kind I hadn't gotten from him since he was about 14. I held on a beat longer than he did. There were 2 other people there, Marisol's brother and his wife, who I'd met once at the wedding and didn't remember well. A man named Corwin and his wife Pilar. They were polite. They asked about my drive. Pilar said something nice about Rosalind, that she'd heard so much about her, and I felt that tightening behind my eyes again and had to look at the floor for a second. We sat down to dinner around 5. Beckett carved the turkey. Rin told a long, tangled story about a girl in her class who had a hamster that escaped. Theo ate 3 rolls and then started in on a 4th, before Marisol gently pulled the basket out of his reach. Beckett poured wine for the adults, and we raised our glasses, and he said something about how grateful he was to have his dad at the table again. Everyone said cheers. I drank. The wine was good. Marisol caught my eye across the table and smiled, and I smiled back, and I felt the warmth of the room settle over me like an extra coat. That's when the phone buzzed. After I came back from the porch, after the call that lasted 11 seconds, I tried to pick up where I'd left off. I asked Ren more about the hamster. I let Theo show me his loose tooth. I helped Marisol clear the salad plates. But I was somewhere else now. I kept replaying the voice. It had been a man, I was almost sure. Older, country accent, maybe Appalachian. Not anyone I knew. And what kept circling around in my head was the part where he'd said, "Don't tell anyone where you're going." Why would he say that? Who would I tell? And then a worse thought. What did he know about who was around me? I watched Beckett at the head of the table. He was laughing at something Corwin had said, his head thrown back, and for a second he looked exactly like the boy I'd taught to ride a bike on a flat stretch of road behind our old house. And then he looked over at Marisol, and something passed between them. A glance. Less than a second, and her chin gave the tiniest nod, and his shoulders dropped a fraction, and they both went back to their plates. Anybody else at that table would have missed it. I almost did, but I had spent 41 years married to Rosalind, and I knew what a couple looks like when they're checking in with each other about something they don't want anyone else to see. I set my fork down. I told him I wasn't feeling great, that the drive must have caught up with me and that I needed to lie down for a bit. Marisol jumped up and said she'd make up the guest room. Beckett said, "Don't be silly, Dad. You can't drive home, stay the night, and we'll do leftovers in the morning." He said it too fast. He said it before I'd even mentioned driving home. And in that moment I understood, the way you understand a stove is hot before your hand touches it, that something at this table was wrong, and that whoever had called me had not been making it up. I told him I just needed some air, that I'd be fine, that I'd stay if I felt better in an hour. I went out to the porch. I called my next-door neighbor Pat, who watches the house when I'm gone and feeds the cat. Pat picked up on the second ring. I asked him, casual as I could, if everything looked okay over at my place. He said as far as he knew, "Sure, why?" I said no reason, just had a funny feeling. He paused for a second. Then he said, "Now that you mention it, there was a truck parked at the end of your driveway about an hour ago when I took the trash out. Dark color." He hadn't recognized it. He'd figured it was somebody using your driveway to turn around. I told him to do me a favor and not go over there. Just keep an eye out and call me if anything changed. He said okay, but he sounded uneasy. I hung up. I stood on that porch for a long time looking out at the yard, where Beckett had hung a string of cafe lights between two oaks. They swayed a little in the wind. Inside the house, I could hear Wren laughing at something. And I made a decision. I went back inside and I told him I felt worse, not better. That I was going to drive to a hotel near the highway because I didn't want to keep anyone up all night. That I'd come back in the morning. Marisol's face did the flicker again. Beckett stood up too quickly. He said, "Dad, you really shouldn't drive. Let me at least follow you." And I said, "No, son. I'll be all right. I'll text you when I get there." I hugged Wren. I shook Theo's hand again. I picked up my coat. I walked out to my truck, and the whole time I was waiting for one of them to physically stop me, and the fact that I was waiting for that should tell you everything about where my head was. I pulled out of the driveway and went 2 blocks. Then I pulled over on a dark stretch of road and sat there with the engine running. I called the sheriff's department in my own county, 4 hours away. I told the woman who answered that I had reason to believe someone was at my house who shouldn't be, that I'd gotten a warning call, that my neighbor had seen an unfamiliar truck. She asked me a lot of careful questions. She took down the address. She said she'd send a deputy out to do a welfare check and call me back. I told her I was on my way home and I'd be there in about 3.5 hours. I drove. I drove faster than I should have. There's a long stretch of highway through the eastern part of the state where there's nothing but pine trees on both sides for 40 miles, and it was on that stretch that the deputy called me back. He said he'd just gotten to the house. The front door was locked. Everything looked normal from the outside. But around the back, the kitchen door was standing open about 6 inches, and the wood around the deadbolt was splintered. He said he wasn't going inside without backup, that they were on the way, and he asked if I had any reason to believe a specific person might be inside. I said no. Then I said wait. I said there might be. I told him my son lived 4 hours away in Wilmington, that I'd been at his house for Thanksgiving dinner, that something had felt off, that I'd left early. The deputy was quiet for a moment. He said okay. He said keep driving. He said he'd call me back. It was the longest 2 hours of my life. Somewhere around hour 1, I crossed the line into truly understanding what I was driving toward. Not just an empty house with a broken door. Something worse than that. A truth I had not been prepared to face on the day I'd been planning for 3 weeks. I thought about Beckett at 14. The year his mother caught him stealing from her purse to buy something. I forget what. The look on her face when she'd told me. The way she'd said, "He didn't even try to hide it well, Hollis. He doesn't think we'll do anything about it." And how I hadn't done much about it. I'd grounded him. I'd given him a talk. I had not made him feel the weight of it. Rosalind had said, years later, that I was a soft father and that someday it would catch up with us. I had laughed her off. I had said our boy was a good boy, that he just needed time to grow into himself. And here I was on a black stretch of highway at 11 o'clock at night, 3 years after she'd been buried, finding out she'd been right. The deputy called back when I was still about 40 minutes out. They had gone inside. There was no one in the house anymore. But the office where I keep my files had been turned upside down. The drawer where I keep important paperwork had been pulled out and dumped, and the safe in the back of my closet, a small one, fireproof that Rosalind and I had bought after we paid off the mortgage, had been pulled out from the wall and was sitting in the middle of the bedroom floor. They hadn't gotten it open. The deputy said it looked like whoever had been in there had been interrupted, or had given up, or had run out of time. He asked what I kept in the safe. I told him. The deed to the house, free and clear. The title to the truck, Rosalind's wedding ring, which she'd asked me before she died to give to Wren, when Wren turned 18, and the paper copy of a brokerage account that had been Rosalind's mother's, which she'd left to Rosalind, and which had grown over the years into something close to $1.5 million. The deputy said, "Well, sir, none of those documents tell anybody where the money actually is." I said no, but the brokerage statement has the firm's name on it and an account number. He said with the account number alone, they can't move money. But if somebody had been planning to be inside that safe for a while, with privacy, they could have taken pictures and started building a case for getting access later, especially if they were claiming to be family. He let that hang there. I let it hang there too. I got home around 1 in the morning. The deputies were gone, but they'd told me to come down to the station first thing in the morning. The kitchen door was patched with a piece of plywood. Somebody from the department had nailed up for me. I walked through every room with the lights on. The house felt like a body that had been touched by a stranger. Rosalind's reading chair was right where it had always been, but somebody had moved the lamp next to it about 4 inches to the left, and that small wrongness made me sit down on the floor of the hallway and cry for the first time in I don't know how long. I didn't sleep. Around 3 in the morning, I got out a yellow legal pad, and I started writing down everything I could remember. The phone call, the voice, the flicker on Marisol's face, the glance between her and Beckett, the way Beckett had said don't drive home before I'd mentioned driving home, the way Pat had described the truck. I wrote it all down. I wrote down dates of phone calls Beckett had made to me over the past year, the few of them, and I tried to remember what each one had been about. I noticed something. Almost every call had ended with him asking, in some sideways way, whether I'd updated my will, or whether I'd thought about what would happen to Mom's account, or whether I had a power of attorney drawn up. I had thought, at the time, that he was being a thoughtful son. Looking out for me, I had thanked him for it. I had told him he didn't need to worry. I had told him everything was in order. I had told him exactly what he needed to know to plan around it. The next morning, I drove down to the sheriff's office. I sat in a small room with 2 deputies and a woman from the state who handled financial crimes against the elderly. She asked me a lot of questions. Then, she asked me one I wasn't expecting. She asked if I'd ever signed any document my son had brought to me to sign in the past 2 years. I had to think about it, and then I remembered. About 8 months back, Beckett had driven down for a Saturday afternoon, the only visit he'd made to my house since the funeral, and he brought a folder of paperwork. He'd said it was for a small life insurance policy he wanted to set up for the grandkids, with me listed as a contingent something or other, and he'd needed my signature on a couple of pages. I had signed. I hadn't read carefully. He'd been in a hurry to get back. I told the woman about it. She closed her eyes for a second. Then she opened them and said, "Sir, we're going to need to look into that." It took about 3 weeks for the picture to come together. The papers I'd signed had not been for a life insurance policy. They had been the front pages of a limited power attorney, with the substantive clauses on later pages I'd never seen. The document gave Beckett authority to make certain financial decisions on my behalf in the event I became incapacitated. By itself, it wasn't enough to do anything, but combined with a doctor's letter saying I was no longer competent to manage my affairs, it would have been enough to start the process of having him appointed my conservator. And on the night of Thanksgiving, while I sat at his table eating turkey, a man Beckett had hired had been in my house looking for the safe. Not for the money inside it directly, for the documents, because once Beckett had the brokerage paperwork, he could walk into the firm with a power of attorney and a letter from a doctor he'd already lined up, and he could begin transferring funds. The doctor turned out to be a guy Beckett had gone to college with, who had a small practice up near Raleigh, and who had agreed to write the letter in exchange for a cut. The man who'd broken into my house was a cousin of the doctor's, the man who'd called me on the porch, and this is the part that still stops me when I think about it, was the doctor's father. An old man, late 70s, who'd found out what his son was getting himself into and had decided, on his own, to do the only thing he could think of to stop it. He'd gotten my number from a piece of paper on his son's kitchen counter. He'd waited until evening. He'd called me 11 seconds, and then he'd hung up because he was scared, and because he wasn't sure if I'd believe him, and because he didn't know what else to say. I drove up to meet him about a month after all of this happened. He lived in a little place outside of Boone. He was sitting on his porch when I pulled up, and he stood up real slow on legs that didn't want to hold him anymore, and he held out his hand. We sat on that porch for 2 hours. He cried about his son. I cried about mine. Neither of us had answers for why our boys had become what they'd become. But I told him that he had saved me, that if he hadn't made that call, I would have slept in Beckett's guest room that night, and the safe would have been opened, and everything would have gone differently. He shook his head and said he'd just done what anybody would have done. I told him no. Most people don't. Most people tell themselves it's not their business. He looked down at his hands and didn't say anything for a long time. Beckett was charged. So was the doctor. So were the two men who'd been at my house. The case took almost a year to work through the courts. Beckett pled out. He did 14 months. Marisol filed for divorce while he was inside, and she has been, to her credit, the one good thing to come out of all this for me. She didn't know. I believed her when she told me she didn't know, and the investigators believed her. And the kids are with her now. Ren and Theo come down to my place for 2 weeks every summer, and a long weekend at Christmas. Ren is 12 now. She has her grandmother's eyes. I gave her the wedding ring on her last birthday, a few years early, because I wanted to do it while I was still myself, and she put it on a chain around her neck and hasn't taken it off since. I changed the will. I set up an irrevocable trust for the grandkids that Beckett can't touch. The bulk of Rosalind's mother's money, the brokerage account, I split between that trust and 3 places: a hospice in our county that took care of Rosalind in her last weeks, a scholarship at the community college in her name for women going back to school in their 40s and 50s, and the volunteer fire department where I served for 18 years. I kept enough to live on. I don't need much. I have the house, I have the truck, I have Pat next door and a few people from the church who check on me. I have a daughter-in-law who calls me every Sunday and grandkids who actually want to come visit. What I don't have is a son. Not really. He sends letters. I don't open them. Maybe one day I will. Rosalind, if she's listening somewhere, would tell me to. She'd tell me that he's still the boy who climbed into bed with us when there was a thunderstorm, and that he's still worth something. And maybe she'd be right. But I'm 67, and I've learned late in life what she was trying to tell me about being soft. There's a difference between forgiving a person and standing in the road they're driving down. I did too much of the second one for too many years. I'm not doing it anymore. If you've gotten this far, thank you. Truly. If this story moved you, hit that like button so the algorithm shows it to somebody else who might need to hear it. Subscribe to the channel for more like this, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves out there, and if your gut is trying to tell you something at the dinner table this year, listen to it. It might be the only voice in the room telling you the truth. I've thought about that Thanksgiving night more times than I can count, and what comes back to me first isn't the broken door or the safe pulled out from the wall. It's the small flicker on Marisol's face when my phone buzzed at the table. That's the moment that haunts me, because that was the moment my body knew something my mind wasn't ready to admit yet. Here's what I've come to understand. Nothing that happened to me that night was random. Beckett didn't wake up one morning a stranger. He became one over a long stretch of years, in small steps that I let pass because each one on its own seemed too small to make a fuss about. The stealing from his mother's purse when he was 14. The lies about grades. The borrowed money that never came back. Each time, I told myself he was a good boy who just needed time. And every time I told myself that, I was teaching him a quiet lesson he heard better than anything I ever said out loud. The lesson was that there were no real consequences in his father's house. Rosalind tried to warn me. I didn't listen. And the man who broke into my home on Thanksgiving night was, in some part, I'll have to live with. A man I helped raise by being too soft to do the hard thing when the hard thing still would have mattered. But I want to say this too, because I don't want anyone hearing my story to walk away thinking it's only about pain. The same night that exposed my son also brought a stranger's voice into my life. An old man up in the mountains who had every reason to stay quiet and who picked up the phone anyway. He didn't know me. He had nothing to gain. He just decided that what was happening was wrong, and that he wasn't going to be the kind of person who looked the other way. That choice cost him something inside his own family. And it saved me. What I've learned late in life is that being a decent person is not about being nice. Being nice is easy. Being decent is harder because it asks you to act when acting will make somebody mad at you. It asks you to set the limit, write your child out of the will, drive 4 hours through the dark, sign the police report with shaking hands. Decency is the muscle most of us never build because we're so worried about being loved that we forget our job is to be honest. If you take anything from what I've shared, take this. Pay attention to the small flicker. Trust the feeling in your chest before your head catches up with it. And if your gut is telling you that someone you love is steering towards something terrible, don't wait for the proof. Have the conversation. Set the line. Be the parent or the friend or the neighbor who is willing to be disliked for telling the truth. I waited too long. The man on the porch in the mountains didn't. I'm here writing this because of him, and every morning I get to spend with my granddaughter Wren is a morning he gave me by being braver than I was.